Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. The hospital loomed over us like a forgotten sentinel, its windows shattered and its walls streaked with grime and graffiti. Rumors had circulated for years about this place. Unexplained disappearances, eerie sounds at night, and, most famously, its morgue, a site of countless whispered stories. For some reason, tonight felt like the right time to see it for ourselves. We were five: me, Mark, Claire, Jenna, and Alex. Armed with flashlights and a sense of daring, we made our way toward the building, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet echoing in the quiet night. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. As we pushed open the rusted doors, the hinges groaned, sending a chill down my spine. Inside, the darkness seemed alive, swallowing the faint beams of our flashlights. The first few minutes felt like a game. We laughed nervously as we navigated the debris-strewn halls, joking about ghosts and urban legends. The hospital's main floor was eerily quiet, its walls lined with peeling paint and remnants of old medical posters. Then Mark brought it up. "We have to check out the morgue," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "That's where all the good stories come from." The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances, but no one objected. It was, after all, the reason we'd come. The descent into the lower levels of the hospital felt like entering another world. The temperature dropped noticeably, the air growing stale and oppressive. The stairs creaked beneath our weight, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed off the tiled walls. When we reached the morgue, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The space was almost pristine compared to the chaos above, its white tiles yellowed with age but otherwise intact. Stainless steel tables stood in the center of the room, their surfaces dull but clean. Along one wall were dozens of body drawers, their metal doors reflecting the glow of our flashlights. Unlike the rest of the hospital, the morgue felt untouched. It was as if time had stopped here. "Creepy," Claire muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. We moved cautiously, our footsteps muffled on the tiled floor. Mark, ever the brave one, approached the drawers first. "I'm gonna open one," he announced, grinning. Before any of us could stop him, he pulled on a handle. The drawer slid out with a metallic scrape. Inside, there were no remains, just a neatly folded set of clothes and a small yellowed envelope. Mark picked up the envelope, revealing an old photograph tucked inside. It showed a man and woman standing in front of a house, their expressions solemn. "Who leaves this kind of stuff behind?" Jenna asked, her voice tinged with unease. We stared at the contents in silence before Mark slid the drawer shut. One drawer became two, then three. Each contained similar items, personal belongings from decades past, clothing, letters, small trinkets, but no remains. The silence in the room grew heavier with each discovery, as though the walls were holding their breath. The farther into the morgue we ventured, the stranger it became. Drawers near the back of the room were partially open, their contents spilling out slightly. A scarf dangled from one, a cracked pocket watch from another. It felt deliberate, as if someone had been here before us, searching for something, or leaving something behind. "Why would these be open?" Alex asked, his voice breaking the tension. None of us answered. The space seemed to stretch and darken as we moved, the rows of drawers towering over us like silent sentinels. I began to notice small details that set my nerves on edge. A shoe that looked freshly scuffed, a drawer handle smeared with something dark, a faint metallic scent in the air. Jenna stopped suddenly, her flashlight trained on a corner of the room. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We all froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the sound of our own breathing. Then, faintly, we heard it, a muffled thud, like something heavy being dropped in a distant room. My chest tightened as the noise repeated, louder this time, echoing through the morgue. "Maybe it's the building settling," Mark offered, though his voice lacked conviction. None of us believed him. The thuds grew louder, more deliberate, until they seemed to be coming from just beyond the morgue. We stood in a tense circle, our flashlights darting toward every shadow, every corner. The air felt heavier, pressing down on us as though the room itself were alive. "Should we check it out?" Mark asked, his bravado wavering. "No way," Claire snapped. "We should leave." Before we could decide, the noise stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then came the faint sound of footsteps, not ours, but measured, deliberate steps moving closer. "Who's there?" Alex called out, his voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. A moment later, a shape emerged from the shadows at the far end of the room. At first, it was just a vague figure, shrouded in darkness. Then another figure appeared beside it. Two men, their faces obscured, stood motionless, watching us. My stomach turned to ice. They didn't speak or move, but their presence was suffocating, their stillness more threatening than any words could have been. "Let's go," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. As if on cue, the men began to advance, their movements slow and deliberate at first, then faster as they closed the distance. "Run!" Mark shouted, and we didn't need to be told twice. We bolted toward the exit, the sound of our panicked footsteps echoing through the morgue. The men's steady, deliberate strides quickened behind us, growing louder and more urgent with each passing second. My heart pounded as we weaved through the rows of drawers, our flashlights bobbing wildly and casting chaotic beams of light that barely illuminated the path ahead. "Don't look back!" Claire shouted, her voice trembling, but I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them, their faces still obscured by shadows, their movements unnervingly controlled despite the chase. They didn't yell or call out. They didn't even look panicked. They just followed, their relentless presence far more terrifying than any outburst could have been. We reached the hallway leading out of the morgue, but the darkness was disorienting. The narrow corridor stretched ahead like a void, the faint beams of our flashlights barely cutting through the gloom. I felt Jenna grab my arm, her grip tight as she pulled me forward. "This way!" she cried, her voice cracking with fear. The sound of something metallic crashing to the floor behind us made me stumble. I didn't look back again. I didn't want to know how close they were. The hospital was a maze. Every hallway looked the same, narrow, dark, and lined with doors that led to nowhere. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, making it harder to breathe. We turned corner after corner, the adrenaline in my veins the only thing keeping me moving. The men's footsteps were relentless, echoing louder, closer, no matter how fast we ran. "Where's the way out?" Alex shouted, his voice strained. "We came down the stairs? Back that way," Mark yelled, pointing toward another hallway. But when we reached it, we found ourselves in another dead end. A room filled with overturned gurneys and scattered medical equipment. The group skidded to a stop, gasping for air, our flashlights sweeping frantically over the room. "Are we trapped?" Claire whispered, panic creeping into her voice. "No, we're not trapped," Mark said, though his voice was far from convincing. "We just have to." Another crash echoed behind us, louder this time, followed by the sound of footsteps accelerating. The men were closing in. Without thinking, we scrambled to move, pushing through a door that led into another hallway. My chest burned, my legs ached, but the fear driving me forward was stronger than the pain. "Over there!" Jenna shouted, pointing to a faint glimmer of light ahead. The faint light grew brighter as we sprinted toward it, a flicker of hope cutting through the terror. It was the stairwell, the same one we'd descended earlier. We threw ourselves through the doorway, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind us. The noise reverberated through the stairwell, deafening in the enclosed space. "Go, go!" Mark urged, motioning for us to climb. The stairs creaked beneath our weight as we ascended two at a time, the narrow walls amplifying every sound, the pounding of our footsteps, the gasps of our breath, and worst of all, the faint echo of the door below creaking open. "They're still coming!" Claire shouted, her voice breaking. We pushed harder, bursting onto the first floor and into the dimly lit hallway that led to the entrance. The shattered glass doors ahead were a beacon, their jagged edges glittering in the moonlight. The cool night air poured in, beckoning us toward safety. As we reached the doors, I dared one last glance back. The two men stood at the far end of the hall, their silhouettes framed by the faint glow of our abandoned flashlights. They didn't move closer, but their stillness was as chilling as their pursuit had been. They simply watched as we stumbled out into the night. It was a long day, and all I could think about was getting home, dropping my bag, and collapsing onto the couch. The elevator ride to my floor felt endless, and by the time the doors slid open, I was already fishing for my keys. The hallway was quiet, the familiar dim lighting casting long shadows on the beige walls. I reached my door and inserted the key, but it didn't slide in smoothly. I jiggled it, wondering if the lock was sticking again. With a little force, it turned, and the door clicked open. I stepped inside, immediately noticing a faint musty smell that I didn't recognize. My tired mind chalked it up to my forgetting to take out the trash earlier, though I didn't remember leaving any out. The living room looked off. The couch was slightly crooked, and the coffee table was cluttered with items I didn't recognize. An empty glass, a crumpled newspaper, a lighter I didn't own. My brain tried to rationalize it, pinning it on exhaustion or forgetfulness, but the unease began to creep in. Then I saw the painting on the wall, a landscape I had never seen before. My heart sank as the realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't my apartment. Panic surged through me as I turned back toward the door, ready to leave before anyone noticed. But I stopped when my eyes landed on the kitchen counter. A knife lay there, smeared with something dark and sticky. Next to it was a piece of torn fabric, stained red. My breathing grew shallow as I scanned the room. The trash bin had been knocked over, its contents spilled across the floor, an empty bottle, broken glass, and a handful of Polaroid photos. The images were hard to make out in the dim light, but I could see faces, blurred, distorted, and what looked like bloodstains on some of them. I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to leave. Now. I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, realizing with a sinking feeling that the door had been locked from the outside. My hands trembled as I twisted and pulled, but it didn't move. I was trapped. A faint sound from the hallway, distant footsteps, snapped me into action. My first instinct was to find somewhere to hide. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, and I rushed inside, locking it behind me. The small space was dark, lit only by a faint sliver of light coming from the gap beneath the door. I pressed my back against the cold tiles, my breath shallow and rapid. My ears strained to pick up any sounds from outside. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, I heard the creak of the front door opening, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. They weren't hurried or frantic. They were measured, controlled, as if the person knew exactly what they were doing. The footsteps moved through the apartment, pausing periodically. The sound of objects being moved, furniture shifting, drawers opening, sent waves of dread through me. I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying to steady my breathing. Then the footsteps stopped. Seconds stretched into eternity before the bathroom door handle jiggled, a quiet, deliberate sound that nearly made my heart stop. Whoever was out there tried the handle again, this time harder, as if testing the lock. I bit down on my lip, tears welling in my eyes as I tried to remain perfectly still. After a moment, the sound stopped, replaced by more footsteps moving away from the bathroom. The minutes that followed were the longest of my life. I remained frozen, my back pressed against the bathroom wall, listening intently for any sign of movement. But the apartment was silent again, save for the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. I checked my phone, hoping to call for help, but realized with horror that I had left it in my bag by the front door. The small comfort of technology was out of reach, leaving me utterly alone in the stifling darkness. Hours seemed to pass. My legs ached, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I considered shouting for help, but feared that whoever had entered the apartment might still be there, waiting. Every creak of the pipes, every distant noise from the building, sent fresh waves of terror through me. Eventually, the silence became too oppressive. I couldn't stay locked in the bathroom forever. My body trembled as I unlocked the door, the faint click of the mechanism sounding deafening in the stillness. I opened the door slowly, peering into the dim apartment. The space was eerily clean. The apartment was unrecognizable. The mess that had been strewn across the floor earlier, the spilled trash, the Polaroids, the knife, was gone. The countertops sparkled under the faint light from the kitchen, and the furniture was neatly arranged as though nothing had happened. My legs felt weak as I stepped cautiously into the living room, my breath catching with every creak of the floorboards. My eyes scanned the space, searching for any sign of the chaos I'd seen earlier, but there was nothing. No bloodstains, no broken glass, no photographs. The air felt too clean, as though the room had been scrubbed of not just evidence, but of its very presence. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the faint draft from the hallway. My stomach turned. Whoever had been here wanted me to leave, and they'd made sure I had nothing to show for what I'd witnessed. A sense of dread clawed at me as I realized how calculated it all felt, as if I had been carefully observed the entire time. I moved toward the door, my steps cautious and deliberate. I half expected someone to appear in the shadows, but the apartment remained deathly silent. The hallway beyond the door was dim and empty, stretching out like a tunnel into the unknown. I didn't stop to think. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I broke into a run, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I hurried to my own apartment, fumbling with my keys. Every sound, every distant murmur, every creak of the building felt amplified, as though the walls themselves were alive with whispers. When I finally reached my door, my hands shook so badly that it took several tries to unlock it. I shoved the door open, stepped inside, and slammed it shut, bolting every lock and sliding the chain into place. My heart raced as I leaned against the door, my chest heaving with each breath. The familiarity of my apartment brought little comfort. It felt different now, too exposed, too vulnerable. I moved through the rooms, checking every window, every closet, every shadowed corner, half expecting to find someone lurking. But I was alone. At least, I thought I was. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands, replaying the night over and over in my mind. The evidence, the bathroom, the sounds of someone trying the door, it all felt like a nightmare, but the aching tension in my body reminded me it was real. The thought of what could have happened, what might still happen, kept my nerves frayed. The clean apartment haunted me. Why had they erased the evidence? Who were they? And, most chillingly, how had they known to trap me in the bathroom? I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was involved had been watching me, their movements deliberate, their intentions methodical. Every sound in my apartment felt like a threat. The hum of the fridge, the faint creaks of the building settling, each one sent a jolt of fear through me. I checked the locks again, my paranoia growing with every passing moment. And then I saw it. On the kitchen counter sat a single Polaroid. My heart stopped. I recognized it instantly. It was one of the photographs I'd seen in the wrong apartment. The blurred face, the faint trace of red on the edges. My hands shook as I reached for it, my stomach twisting into knots. How had it gotten here? I barely slept that night, the Polaroid sitting on the counter like a taunting reminder of what I'd seen. The fear of being watched consumed me. Every glance out the window felt like a risk, every shadow in the hallway a potential threat. I tried to convince myself it was over, but the photograph said otherwise. The next morning, I considered calling the police. But what could I tell them? I'd accidentally entered the wrong apartment, seen evidence of a crime that no longer existed, and fled. I couldn't even explain how the Polaroid had ended up in my possession. It sounded insane. The day passed in a haze, my anxiety gnawing at me like a slow burn. By evening, I was exhausted but too afraid to close my eyes. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television, when a faint knock echoed from the door. My blood ran cold. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stay still. The knock came again, louder this time. I crept toward the peephole, my heart hammering against my ribs. The hallway was empty. I stepped away from the door, short of breath. The Polaroid was still on the counter, its presence a silent accusation. But time passed, and the calm gradually returned. It started on an ordinary evening. I had just returned home from work, my arms full of groceries, when I noticed the white van parked across the street. Its engine was idling faintly, the sound blending into the suburban hum of crickets and distant traffic. I didn't think much of it at first. Vans like that were common enough in the area. Delivery drivers, repair technicians, maybe even someone visiting a neighbor. Still, something about it felt off. There were no logos or markings on the sides, just plain white panels that reflected the faint glow of the streetlights. The windows in the back were tinted, offering no view inside. As I unlocked my front door, I stole a glance at the driver's seat, but I couldn't make out much, just a vague silhouette sitting unnervingly still. I shook it off as paranoia. People parked in strange spots all the time, I told myself. It wasn't worth a second thought. But even as I unpacked the groceries and settled in for the night, the image of the van lingered in the back of my mind. The van began appearing more often after that night. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. It would show up in the evening, parked a little further down the street or across the block. I noticed it in the morning, too, its pristine exterior catching the first rays of sunlight, always in a spot that offered a clear view of my house. I started paying more attention. Through the blinds, I watched as the van idled for long stretches of time, its driver never stepping out. Once or twice, I thought I saw movement behind the tinted windows, vague shapes shifting in the shadows. But it was impossible to tell who or how many were inside. At first, I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe someone was working odd hours, waiting for a client, or taking a break. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. Wherever I was, the van wasn't far behind. I saw it at the grocery store one afternoon, parked several rows away. Another time, it was on the opposite side of the street from my usual coffee shop. I even spotted it during a jog in the park, sitting motionless in the lot near the trailhead. By then, unease had begun to creep into every aspect of my life. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The paranoia consumed me. I started waking up in the middle of the night, checking the street from my bedroom window. More often than not, the van was there, parked under the dim streetlight like a silent sentinel. Its presence made my skin crawl. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That a van was parked in my neighborhood? It wasn't illegal to park on a public street. I began taking detours on my way home, changing my routine in subtle ways to see if it would follow me. And it did. One day, I turned down an unfamiliar side street, only to spot the van a few cars behind me. Another time, I doubled back on foot while walking through the park, and there it was again, parked at the trail's entrance like it was waiting for me. Friends brushed off my concerns when I brought it up, joking that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But they weren't the ones constantly seeing that van, feeling its silent presence at the edge of their lives. I started keeping my curtains drawn, my door locked at all times. The tension was suffocating. I thought a walk might clear my head. The air was crisp, and the quiet streets near the edge of the neighborhood seemed inviting. It was a path I didn't usually take, secluded and lined with old trees whose shadows stretched long in the late afternoon light. I was halfway down the block when I heard it, the faint rumble of an engine. My stomach dropped as the familiar white van rolled into view at the far end of the street. It slowed to a crawl, its headlights dim as it crept closer. The street was empty, no other cars or pedestrians in sight. My heart raced as the van came to a stop several yards ahead, its side door facing me. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door slid open, and a man stepped out. He was average in every way, average height, average build, dressed in dark, nondescript clothing. But there was something about the way he moved, calm, deliberate, that made my skin crawl. He didn't speak or gesture, just started walking toward me. I froze, my body locked in place by a wave of fear. He was too calm, his strides too measured, as if he knew I had nowhere to go. My mind screamed at me to move, and finally my legs obeyed. I turned and sprinted toward the nearest alley, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Behind me, I heard the heavy thud of the van's door sliding shut, followed by the quickening rhythm of footsteps. The alley was narrow and dimly lit, lined with overflowing dumpsters and discarded debris. My sneakers pounded against the cracked pavement as I ran, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The footsteps behind me were steady, deliberate, each one reverberating like a hammer strike against my nerves. I darted left, then right, weaving through the labyrinthine back streets, hoping to lose him. My heart raced as I scanned my surroundings for an escape route. The walls felt like they were closing in, each turn leading to another stretch of endless concrete. Then I heard it, the low rumble of the van's engine. My stomach dropped. It had found another way around, cutting me off. Up ahead, the van emerged from a side street, its headlights casting harsh beams that seemed to pierce right through me. It stopped abruptly, blocking the path. Panic surged through me, my mind racing for options. The footsteps behind me quickened, and I realized I was being cornered. Desperation took over. I spotted a gap between two buildings, a narrow passage barely wide enough to squeeze through. Without thinking, I threw myself into it, my shoulders scraping against the rough brick walls as I forced my way through. The sound of the van's engine roared louder, as if it were trying to follow, but the gap was too tight. The footsteps behind me faltered, their echo fading as I pushed further into the passage. When I emerged on the other side, I found myself in a crowded main street. The sight of people, ordinary, oblivious pedestrians, felt like salvation. I stumbled into the throng, my legs trembling, my chest heaving. The van didn't follow. I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, ducking into a cafe that was bustling with activity. My hands trembled as I ordered a drink, hoping the normalcy of the environment would calm me. But the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I sat near the window, my eyes scanning the street outside. Every white vehicle that passed sent a jolt of panic through me, but none of them stopped, none of them parked. I told myself I was safe now, but the memory of the man's calm, deliberate strides haunted me. He hadn't rushed, hadn't seemed concerned about being seen. It was as if he'd known exactly how to corner me, how to make me feel trapped. By the time I left the cafe, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets. I took a winding route home, checking over my shoulder every few minutes, my nerves frayed. When I finally reached my building, I hesitated outside, scanning the parking lot for any sign of the van. It wasn't there. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, locked the door behind me, and slid the chain into place. For the first time in hours, I allowed myself to breathe. The silence of my apartment was oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, sent my nerves into overdrive. I couldn't shake the feeling that the van, or the man, was still out there, waiting for the right moment to appear again. I checked the windows repeatedly, my eyes scanning the street below. There were no signs of the van, but that didn't bring comfort. The absence felt deliberate, calculated, as if they were waiting for me to lower my guard. My phone vibrated, startling me. It was a message from a friend asking if I was free to hang out. For a moment, I considered replying, but the idea of leaving the apartment felt impossible. I typed out an excuse and tossed the phone onto the couch. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every noise outside made me sit up, my heart racing. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadows and the sound of footsteps growing closer and closer. The forest stretched endlessly before me, its dense trees blotting out much of the sky. I had ventured deep into this remote area on a whim, seeking the kind of solitude that only untouched wilderness could offer. The crunch of my boots on the forest floor was the only sound accompanying me. It was peaceful, almost meditative, until I spotted the car. It sat in an unnatural position, tilted slightly as if it had been abandoned in haste. The vehicle's metallic frame was streaked with grime, its windows smeared with dirt and faint streaks of something darker. I approached cautiously, every step stirring a growing unease. The car didn't belong here. There was no road or trail leading to this spot. It was as though it had simply materialized. The closer I got, the more unsettling the details became. The driver's door hung slightly ajar, revealing the interior, a chaotic mess of torn upholstery, scattered items, and blood. My stomach turned as I noticed the smears of red on the steering wheel and across the dashboard. It wasn't just a spot or a splatter, it was deliberate, as though someone had wiped their hands there in panic. On the passenger seat lay a crumpled piece of paper. I leaned in, hesitant, and retrieved it. It was part of a map, jaggedly torn and weathered with age. A red circle marked a location not far from where I stood. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the forest was empty. Still, the silence now felt less serene and more oppressive. I clutched the torn map in one hand, my other gripping my pack strap tightly as I debated my next move. The sensible part of me screamed to leave, to turn back and forget I ever saw the car. But something about that red circle gnawed at me. It was too deliberate, too pointed, as if it were meant to draw someone in. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow it. The trek wasn't easy. The marked spot on the map wasn't along any clear path, forcing me to weave through thick undergrowth and navigate uneven terrain. The further I ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The air grew heavier, the trees more gnarled and twisted, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The quiet deepened, an unnatural hush that swallowed every sound I made. Even the rustle of leaves underfoot seemed muted, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. I glanced at the map again, the red circle now feeling more like a warning than a destination. My pulse quickened, but I pressed on, drawn by a mix of fear and an unshakable need to know what lay ahead. When I saw the hut, I froze. It was just as the map had suggested, a small, weathered structure tucked away in a hollow surrounded by trees. The building looked ancient, its wooden walls streaked with moss and decay. Broken windows stared out like empty eyes, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. I hesitated at the tree line, scanning the area for any signs of life. There was none. No smoke from a chimney, no sound of movement inside. Yet, the hut exuded a presence, as if it were alive in its own sinister way. The surrounding forest seemed to lean inward, as though the trees themselves sought to shield the structure from view. Steeling myself, I moved closer. The air seemed to thicken with every step, a subtle resistance pressing against me. The closer I got, the more I noticed. A single chair placed just outside the door, its seat splintered. A scattering of rusted tools half buried in the ground, and dark stains trailing from the doorway, leading inside. My throat tightened, but my feet continued forward, as if propelled by some invisible force. The door was ajar, its hinges rusted and barely holding the warped wood in place. I pushed it open cautiously, the creak splitting the oppressive silence like a scream. The interior was dark, the weak light from outside barely penetrating the grime-covered windows. I stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and something metallic, blood. The room was small and sparsely furnished. A wooden table stood in the corner, its surface littered with papers and small, unidentifiable objects. A single chair sat beneath it, tipped over as though someone had fled in haste. On the floor, dark stains spread outward in chaotic patterns, their origin unclear but unmistakable in their implication. Then I saw it. In the center of the room stood a figure, a shadowy silhouette against the dim light filtering through the broken windows. It was tall and human-shaped, but there was something wrong about its stillness. It didn't move, didn't breathe, yet it felt alive in a way I couldn't comprehend. My heart pounded as I stared, frozen in place. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coat rack or a trick of the light, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't convince myself. The figure's presence filled the room, suffocating in its silence. A primal fear gripped me, and my instincts took over. Without a second thought, I turned and bolted out the door, my pulse thundering in my ears as I sprinted back toward the forest. The forest closed in around me as I ran, but my thoughts were trapped in the suffocating confines of that hut. The figure's image was burned into my mind, its unnerving stillness, the oppressive weight it seemed to radiate. I had only glanced at it for a moment, but that was enough. It wasn't just an object or a shadow. It was something else, something wrong. My breath came in ragged gasps as I forced myself to stop. I turned back toward the hut, though I was still several meters away. The door swung slightly in the breeze, creaking softly as though mocking my escape. The forest remained eerily silent. No wind stirred the leaves. No birds called. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. The figure's presence was like a hook lodged in my chest, pulling at me even as I wanted to flee. I squinted at the doorway, hoping to see something that would explain what I'd just encountered. My mind grasped for logic, for some rational explanation to tether me back to reality. But then, just for an instant, I thought I saw movement, a subtle shift in the darkness inside. My heart seized. The figure wasn't stationary. It was waiting. The thought shattered any remaining resolve I had. I turned and bolted, tearing through the undergrowth with reckless abandon. The trees seemed closer now, their branches clawing at me as though they, too, wanted to hold me back. I stumbled but caught myself, the adrenaline pushing me forward even as fear clawed at the edges of my mind. I had no sense of direction anymore. The forest, which had seemed so tranquil earlier, now felt alien and hostile. Paths I had taken earlier appeared unfamiliar, as though the woods had shifted in my absence. My breathing was shallow, my legs heavy, but I didn't stop. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of my frantic movements, but even that felt muted, as though the forest were swallowing the noise. Every time I glanced back, I saw nothing but shadows. Yet the feeling of being watched remained, pressing against me like a physical force. It wasn't just the hut or the figure. The entire forest felt wrong now, as though it were complicit in whatever malevolent force I had disturbed. My foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through my palms as they scraped against the rough dirt, but I didn't care. I scrambled back to my feet, my eyes darting around for any sign of pursuit. The shadows at the edges of my vision seemed to shift, but when I focused on them, they were still. My paranoia was spiraling, but I couldn't shake the certainty that I wasn't alone. I stumbled onward, my energy draining with every step. The forest grew darker, the trees denser, until finally, I spotted a familiar marker, a weathered tree with a deep scar in its trunk. Relief surged through me. I was close to where I had started. The abandoned car came into view, its grim presence now a beacon of safety. I practically threw myself against the driver's side door, fumbling with the handle before remembering it was still unlocked. I slid into the seat, slamming the door shut and locking it in one frantic motion. My fingers trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, my gaze darting between the rearview mirror and the dense forest beyond the windshield. The silence was deafening. Even inside the car, I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in. My hand shook as I reached for the ignition, the keys rattling against the steering column. The engine sputtered for a heart-stopping moment before roaring to life. The sound shattered the stillness, momentarily grounding me in reality. I reversed clumsily, the tires crunching over the forest floor, and turned the car toward the faint path I had driven in on. As I maneuvered back onto the overgrown trail, I couldn't help but glance at the forest one last time. The hut was no longer visible, but the shadows seemed darker, denser, as though they had gathered in one place. I pressed the gas pedal harder, the car bouncing over uneven ground as I navigated the narrow trail. The feeling of being watched didn't fade, not even as the road became more defined, and I left the forest behind. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel. My focus split between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, where the dense trees receded into the distance. When I felt safer, I stopped the car and abandoned it because it wasn't my car. I finished the trail, but I didn't feel completely calm until I got home. I first noticed the flyer while waiting at a bus stop, its bright colors and bold text practically screaming for attention. Free youth event, it read, accompanied by promises of games, music, food, and a chance to meet new people. It seemed harmless enough, a rare opportunity to break the monotony of my routine. I scanned the details. The event was set for the upcoming weekend, at a community center I'd never heard of. The directions were simple, though the location seemed a little out of the way. Curiosity got the better of me. I didn't have much planned for the weekend, and the idea of meeting new people sounded appealing. I folded the flyer and slipped it into my pocket. Later that evening, I searched online for information about the event, but there wasn't much to find. A generic website with vague descriptions and a contact form was all I could uncover. It felt a bit odd, but not enough to deter me. By the time Saturday rolled around, I had convinced myself it would be a fun experience. Grabbing my bag, I set out for the event, determined to make the most of it. As I drove toward the address on the flyer, I noticed the scenery growing more remote. The paved roads gave way to narrower streets, and eventually, a dirt path led me to the venue. My unease began to creep in, but I pushed it aside, reminding myself that sometimes the best experiences come from stepping out of your comfort zone. The community center was smaller than I'd imagined, a squat, nondescript building surrounded by sparse trees. A few cars were parked in the gravel lot, but it didn't seem like the bustling event I'd envisioned. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the door handle, before convincing myself to go in. As I stepped inside, the first thing that struck me was the silence. There was no music, no chatter, just the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The organizers greeted me with wide smiles and an unsettling level of enthusiasm. Their voices were overly friendly, almost rehearsed, as they handed me a lanyard with my name hastily scrawled on it. The interior was dimly lit, with a few tables set up along the walls and minimal decorations that did little to brighten the space. A handful of attendees milled about, but they seemed disengaged, their faces blank and distant. A man in a bright polo shirt gestured toward a refreshment table, where a sparse selection of snacks sat under plastic wrap. "Help yourself. We're so glad you could make it," he said, his smile unwavering. I nodded and moved deeper into the room, my initial excitement replaced by a growing sense of discomfort. The atmosphere felt off, like stepping into a play where everyone had forgotten their lines. I tried to blend in, walking to the refreshment table and grabbing a small plate of snacks. The food looked fine, sandwiches, cookies, some chips, but tasted strange, as if it had been left out too long. Still, I forced myself to eat a few bites, hoping it would ease the tension gnawing at me. I glanced around the room, observing the other attendees. Most were my age, maybe a little older, but something about them seemed wrong. They moved stiffly, their expressions vacant as they shuffled between activities. A girl sitting near the wall stared at her phone screen, though it didn't look like it was on. The organizers, on the other hand, were a stark contrast. Too animated, their energy almost manic. They floated between groups, engaging in brief, shallow conversations that felt more like interrogations. One of them approached me, asking questions about where I was from, how I heard about the event, and if I was enjoying myself. I answered as vaguely as possible, the intensity of their focus making me uncomfortable. As I wandered closer to the edges of the room, I noticed several doors leading to other parts of the building. All of them were closed, and some appeared locked. A faint sound, like muffled voices or movement, came from behind one of the doors, but when I leaned closer to listen, it stopped abruptly. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Something wasn't right here. I tried to shake off my unease, but the details were piling up. The locked doors, the strange food, the odd behavior of the attendees. It all felt orchestrated, like I was part of a carefully managed scene. Even the few games set up in one corner seemed off. A card game with missing pieces, a board game with rules that made no sense. It was as if the activities were just props meant to occupy us without real intention. The organizers' behavior grew increasingly strange. Their overly friendly demeanor began to shift, subtle but noticeable. They watched me more closely now, their smiles faltering whenever I moved toward the exit or tried to engage another attendee. I tested the waters, casually mentioning I might need to leave early. Their responses were polite but firm, encouraging me to stay a little longer or see the event through to the end. It was then I realized how isolated we were. The community center was far from town, and I hadn't seen another vehicle on the way in. My phone had no signal, and the building had no visible landlines. I felt trapped, the air in the room growing heavier with every passing minute. When one of the organizers moved to block the main entrance, their posture casual but deliberate, I knew I needed to get out. Whatever this event was, it wasn't what it seemed, and staying any longer felt like inviting something worse. I forced myself to appear calm, though my heart was pounding. I knew I couldn't just walk out. The organizers were too watchful, their friendly facade now laced with something more sinister. I needed a reason, something that wouldn't arouse suspicion. My mind raced as I scanned the room, searching for a way to leave without drawing attention. An idea struck. I clutched my stomach and winced, pretending to feel ill. I approached one of the organizers, a woman with a strained smile and overly bright eyes. "I think I ate something bad," I murmured, keeping my voice low and avoiding direct eye contact. "I need to step out for a minute." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly, scrutinizing me. "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that," she said, her tone syrupy. "Are you sure you're okay? We have a first aid kit if you need it." "No, I'll be fine," I said quickly, forcing a weak smile. "I just need some air." She hesitated for a moment too long, her gaze flicking to another organizer across the room. They exchanged a glance, and my stomach sank. She finally nodded, stepping aside. "Of course. Let us know if you need anything." I moved toward the exit, trying to maintain a calm, measured pace. My palms were sweating, and I fought the urge to look over my shoulder. I pushed the door open, the cool evening air hitting me like a splash of water. It steadied me, but I couldn't afford to linger. I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and that building. The gravel crunched beneath my feet as I hurried across the parking lot. The sparse trees surrounding the community center felt like they were closing in, their dark silhouettes blending into the encroaching night. My car was parked near the edge of the lot, its faint outline barely visible in the dim light. I quickened my pace, each step accompanied by the nagging sensation that I was being watched. As I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my shaking hands betraying my rising panic. Behind me, the door to the community center creaked open. I froze, my breath hitching. The sound of footsteps followed, deliberate and unhurried. I didn't dare turn around. My fingers finally found the keyhole, and I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. A figure stood near the entrance, backlit by the faint light spilling from inside. They didn't move, but their presence was enough to send a fresh wave of fear through me. I started the engine, the sound breaking the silence like a gunshot. The figure didn't flinch, but I didn't wait to see what they would do next. The tires skidded on the loose gravel as I sped out of the lot, the narrow dirt road twisting through the trees. The headlights cast fleeting shadows across the branches, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the periphery. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I kept my focus on the road ahead, refusing to look back. By the time I reached a main road, my pulse had slowed, but the unease remained. I drove aimlessly for a while, the events replaying in my mind like a loop. The organizers, the locked doors, the unsettling silence, it all felt like pieces of a larger, darker puzzle I couldn't quite solve. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that the event had been a trap. The flyer's vague promises, the remote location, the isolating atmosphere, it had all been designed to lure people in. I shuddered at the realization of how easily I had walked into it. If I hadn't trusted my instincts, if I hadn't left when I did, I didn't want to think about what might have happened. The faces of the other attendees flashed in my mind. Their distant stares, their unnatural stillness. Had they noticed the same things I had, or had they already been pulled too far into whatever was happening there? I felt a pang of guilt for leaving them behind, but what could I have done? I wasn't even sure what I had escaped from. The road stretched endlessly ahead, its monotony broken only by the faint hum of the car and the occasional blur of headlights from distant travelers. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they needed to. It wasn't just the fatigue, it was the silence of the night, the kind that pressed against your skin like a second layer. The GPS claimed I had another 3 hours to go, but my body had other ideas. My back ached, my eyes burned, and the road seemed to waver under the dim glow of my headlights. The sign for the rest area appeared like a lifeline. It loomed in the distance, a beacon of temporary relief. I didn't think twice. The turnoff was abrupt, leading to an empty stretch of asphalt bordered by sparse trees. The parking lot was almost deserted, save for a single vehicle parked on the far side, its windows too dark to see through. I rolled to a stop near the center of the lot, leaving plenty of space between myself and the other car. Stepping out, the air was cool and carried the faint, musty scent of rain-soaked concrete. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering just enough to be noticed. I stretched, shaking off the stiffness that had taken hold during the drive. The place was oddly still, not quiet in the usual way, but unnaturally devoid of sound. No crickets, no rustling leaves, not even the faint hum of distant traffic. It felt like the world had paused, leaving me in its stagnant center. I glanced around the lot. The restroom building stood to the right, its dull beige paint barely visible under the weak lighting. Beyond that, shadows stretched into the dense tree line, their outlines merging with the dark. I shivered, more from unease than the chill, but forced myself to breathe deeply. It was just a rest stop. I just needed a few minutes. That was all. Leaning against my car, I let my eyes wander across the parking lot, trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The lone car on the far side sat completely still, its presence unsettling despite the logical part of my mind insisting it was harmless. I turned my gaze to the tree line, where the shadows seemed thicker than they should have been. That was when I first felt it. A faint, prickling sensation on the back of my neck. It wasn't pain, nor was it easy to ignore. It was the kind of awareness that told you someone was watching. Slowly, almost reluctantly, I turned my head toward the trees. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the sensation. My eyes strained to pierce the darkness, but all I could make out were vague outlines of branches swaying gently in a non-existent breeze. I rubbed my arms and decided it was enough fresh air. Pulling the door handle, I climbed back into the car, locking the doors almost on instinct. I stared straight ahead, trying to calm myself. The dashboard lights cast a faint glow across the interior, providing a small comfort. But then, as if summoned by my unease, something flickered in the corner of my eye. My head snapped toward the far end of the lot. This time, I saw it, or thought I did. A shape moved along the tree line, its outline just barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. It was tall, humanoid, but indistinct. It didn't move naturally. Its motions were too slow, too fluid. I blinked, and it was gone. The unease began to deepen, sinking into my chest like a cold weight. My fingers hovered over the ignition, but I didn't start the car. Not yet. I wanted to convince myself that I was imagining things, that it was just exhaustion playing tricks on my senses. But as I scanned the lot again, I caught sight of more movement. This time, there were multiple shapes. They were all at the edges of the light, just far enough that I couldn't make out their faces, or if they even had faces. They didn't advance, nor did they retreat. They lingered, shifting slightly as though waiting for something. My stomach tightened. The rest area, which had seemed like a safe reprieve minutes ago, now felt like a trap. I glanced toward the restroom building, hoping for another human presence. The area was as deserted as before. Even the single parked car now felt suspicious. I couldn't recall if I had seen anyone inside it, and the windows remained as dark and impenetrable as the surrounding shadows. A wave of helplessness began to creep in. I needed to leave, but the thought of turning on my engine, of breaking the oppressive silence, felt impossible. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. My perception of time had started to warp. The figures were still there, unmoving but undeniably present. Then I noticed something else, something more alarming. The usual exit routes were no longer visible. At first I thought it was my imagination, but as I craned my neck to get a better view, it became clear that the shadows had shifted. They were now closer to the access points, their vague outlines filling the spaces where my escape routes should have been. Panic surged through me. My pulse hammered in my ears as I struggled to think clearly. This couldn't be happening. Shadows didn't move like that, didn't block paths. I blinked hard, hoping the illusion would break, but when I opened my eyes, the figures had drawn even closer. Their presence was suffocating, even though they hadn't made a sound or moved toward the car directly. I gripped the steering wheel and stared straight ahead, forcing myself to focus. There had to be another way out, some path they hadn't covered yet. My eyes darted back and forth across the lot until they landed on a narrow, overgrown path near the far edge of the parking lot. It wasn't a proper road, just a dirt trail partially obscured by bushes, but it was something. I forced my hands to steady as I shifted the car into gear. The engine's rumble shattered the heavy silence, reverberating off the surrounding trees like a warning shot. My eyes locked on the narrow path at the edge of the lot. It was barely wide enough for a vehicle, its entrance shrouded in shadows that seemed to writhe as the headlights swept over them. I had no choice. It was the only route left. As I turned the car toward the makeshift exit, the shadowy figures reacted. Their movements were subtle but undeniable, a slow, collective shift that brought them closer to the main routes. They didn't run or rush. Instead, they seemed to glide, their forms unnatural and disjointed, as if their presence alone could corral me into submission. My foot hovered over the gas pedal, my pulse racing as I struggled to keep my breathing steady. The path was closer now, but so were they. The figures seemed to multiply, their numbers growing each time I blinked. I no longer tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Logic had no place here. My headlights caught glimpses of something reflective. Eyes, maybe, but they vanished as quickly as they appeared. My car inched forward, the sound of the gravel beneath the tires a desperate reminder of my precarious position. The gap to the trail was still open, but the shadows lingered unnervingly close. I didn't have time to consider the consequences. I gripped the wheel, leaned forward, and pressed the gas harder than I intended. The car jerked forward, and the figures seemed to flinch back momentarily, their forms fading into the periphery as I barreled toward the path. The tires skidded slightly as the car hit the dirt trail, loose rocks scattering in its wake. The path was narrower than I'd expected, its uneven surface making every bump and jolt feel like a small explosion under my seat. The tree branches hung low, scraping against the windows and roof in sharp, grating strokes that sounded almost deliberate. I kept my foot steady on the gas, refusing to slow down, even as the path twisted and turned erratically. The rest area was behind me now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rearview mirror reflected only darkness, but I didn't dare glance for more than a second. My focus stayed glued to the trail ahead, illuminated in fragmented bursts by the bouncing headlights. The shadows seemed to press in from the sides, their shapes flickering between the trees like living smoke. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to go faster, but the path was unforgiving. The car bucked over an exposed root, and for a terrifying moment, I thought the engine would stall. I pressed the gas pedal harder, and the car roared in protest but pushed forward. The oppressive feeling in the air grew stronger, heavier, as though the shadows were trying to drag me back toward them. Just as I thought the trail would never end, a faint glimmer of light appeared ahead. It was dim, but it was unmistakably the glow of a main road. Relief coursed through me, but I didn't allow myself to relax. Not yet. The car burst onto the paved road with a jarring lurch, the tires screeching as they made contact with the asphalt. I barely slowed down, speeding away from the path without so much as a glance back. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, but I kept them steady enough to hold my course. The oppressive weight that had filled the rest area seemed to lift slightly, but it didn't disappear entirely. I risked a quick look in the rearview mirror. The entrance to the trail was now a small, shrinking dot behind me, but the shadows remained. They didn't follow, at least not visibly, but their presence lingered like an after-image burned into my vision. The road ahead was empty, stretching out into the night like an endless void, but I couldn't stop driving. The thought of pulling over, of letting my guard down even for a moment, felt impossible. The silence in the car was deafening. I turned on the radio, hoping for some distraction, but only static greeted me. I turned it off immediately. The sound reminded me too much of the buzzing lights at the rest area, of the oppressive quiet that had enveloped me there. I forced myself to focus on the road, my grip on the wheel tightening with every mile. The property had been vacant for only a week, but it felt like it had been abandoned for years. I stood at the front door with my keys in hand, the quiet street behind me amplifying the creak of the hinge as I pushed the door open. A faint, musty smell wafted out, stale air mixed with something sharper, something chemical. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The house was still, unnaturally so. The usual signs of a rushed departure were there, furniture slightly out of place, dust collecting in corners, a few items left behind as if forgotten. I made my way through the living room, my eyes scanning for damage or anything that might need repair before listing the property again. At first glance, everything seemed fine, just neglected. But there was a heaviness in the air, an odd sensation I couldn't quite place. I told myself it was just the silence, the absence of life in a space that had once been occupied. Still, as I moved deeper into the house, that feeling of emptiness began to shift into something else. The closet in the spare bedroom caught my attention first. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a disorganized mess of old clothes and discarded boxes. I opened it fully, brushing aside a jacket that smelled faintly of mildew. That's when I saw the notes. They were scattered across the floor, some crumpled, others folded neatly. Picking one up, I realized it wasn't ordinary. These weren't grocery lists or forgotten reminders. The handwriting was erratic, the words disjointed. Phrases like, "they're watching," and "keep the windows covered," leapt off the page. Some of the notes were more detailed, outlining bizarre instructions or cryptic warnings. A chill ran through me as I reached for a stack of Polaroid photos tucked between the papers. Each photo was of a different person, all taken from a distance. None of them appeared to know they were being photographed. My stomach churned as I flipped through the stack, the faces unfamiliar and the implications unsettling. In the corner of the closet, a small plastic bag caught my eye. Inside were remnants of drug paraphernalia, burnt spoons, used syringes, and what looked like tiny baggies. I dropped it back into the pile and stepped away, my pulse quickening. The notes, the photos, the paraphernalia, it all painted a picture of a life far more chaotic and secretive than I'd imagined. Determined to finish the inspection, I moved through the rest of the house, but my unease grew with every step. The kitchen cabinets were empty save for a few mismatched plates, but the walls bore deep scratches, as if someone had dragged something heavy against them. In the bedroom, I found more signs of damage, hastily patched holes in the walls and stains on the carpet that resisted my attempts to identify them. The bed frame was broken, the mattress shoved into the corner as though it had been abandoned in frustration. The bathroom was worse. The mirror was cracked, a jagged line running diagonally across its surface, and the tub was coated in a faint, reddish residue. I couldn't tell if it was rust or something else, and I didn't want to linger long enough to find out. Everywhere I turned, I felt as though I was intruding on something that wasn't meant to be seen. The house felt less like an empty rental and more like a crime scene frozen in time. As I made my way back toward the living room, something caught my attention. The front door. I was sure I had closed it behind me, but now it was slightly ajar, swinging softly in the breeze. I froze, my eyes darting to the windows. They were still locked. A nervous laugh escaped me. Maybe I hadn't latched the door properly. But as I walked over to shut it, I noticed something else. A faint footprint in the dust near the entryway. It wasn't mine. The realization hit me hard. Someone else had been here. Maybe they still were. My eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, every shadow. The house was silent, but now it felt oppressive, like it was holding its breath. I checked the other rooms, forcing myself to move despite the fear gnawing at my gut. In the bedroom, the closet door I had left open was now closed. My cleaning supplies, which I'd set neatly on the kitchen counter, were slightly askew. Then, as I stood in the hallway, a sound broke the silence. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the soft creak of a floorboard. I stood frozen in the hallway, every muscle in my body locked in place. The creak I had heard was subtle, but it was enough to send a cold wave of fear through me. My first instinct was to dismiss it, to convince myself that it was just the house settling. But deep down, I knew better. Summoning what little courage I had, I stepped forward, my movements slow and deliberate. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with closed doors. I hadn't opened them all yet, and the thought of what might be behind them sent a shiver down my spine. Reaching the bedroom, I hesitated before pushing the door open. The room was as I'd left it, disheveled but still. But something caught my eye, the closet door. It had been ajar before, and now it was shut. My heart raced as I approached, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I yanked it open in one swift motion, bracing myself for... what? I wasn't sure. The closet was empty, its contents undisturbed. But at the bottom, near the pile of notes and photos, was something new. A half-empty water bottle. The bottle was cold to the touch. Someone had been here, and recently. I dropped it, stepping back as panic surged through me. The faint smell of cigarette smoke hung in the air, a detail I had dismissed earlier but now couldn't ignore. Whoever had left this behind wasn't far. By the time night fell, I had convinced myself to stay. I told myself I needed proof, evidence to give to the authorities. The unease that had gnawed at me all day had grown into full-blown dread, but I couldn't leave without knowing more. I locked myself in the living room, sitting on the couch with my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I had already considered calling the police, but what could I tell them? That I'd found some unsettling notes and photos? That I thought someone might still be coming back to the house? It all sounded too vague, too paranoid. The first noise came just after midnight, a faint thud from the back of the house. My breath hitched as I strained to listen, the silence amplifying every creak and groan of the old structure. A moment later, another sound followed, a soft scraping, like something being dragged across the floor. I stayed rooted to the couch, my body rigid with fear. My eyes darted toward the hallway, but the darkness beyond the doorway was impenetrable. The sounds grew louder, closer, until they stopped altogether. I waited, every second stretching into an eternity. Then the floorboard just outside the living room creaked. I don't remember how I made it through the night. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, my nerves were completely frayed. I didn't wait to hear another sound. Grabbing my keys, I bolted out of the house, slamming the door shut behind me. Sitting in my car, I finally called the police. My voice was shaky as I described everything. The notes, the photos, the signs that someone had been returning to the property. I expected skepticism, but the dispatcher's tone grew serious when I mentioned the drug paraphernalia and the late-night noises. Officers arrived within the hour, their presence a small comfort as they entered the house. I stayed outside, pacing near the car as they searched the property. When they emerged, their expressions were grim. They confirmed what I already knew. Someone had been in the house recently. They found fresh footprints in the dust, cigarette ashes near the kitchen, and another water bottle hidden in the bedroom. But whoever it was had managed to slip away. The police promised to monitor the area and urged me to change the locks immediately. I wasted no time securing the property, but even with new locks and added precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The house felt tainted, its walls heavy with the weight of what I'd found. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started.